So I'll show a project. It was called the Fun Palace, which is a good name for a project. And the designer is Cedric Price, but this was his brief. This is what the client wanted. And it was in London. Sorry for not all being in Hong Kong. In London, we were going to create a university of the streets. Not a big park, not a gracious park, but a foretaste of the pleasures of the future. The essence of the place will be informality. Nothing obligatory, anything goes. There will be no permanent structures. Nothing is to last more than 10 years. Some things won't even last 10 days. So that's a pretty interesting place to start if you're an architect. Here's a project, but don't do any building, and it won't last maybe more than 10 days. How do you approach that? What kind of architecture or planning emerges from that as a brief? And this kind of brief, maybe in the 1960s when it happened, was very original. Nowadays, any competition entry, any sort of big urban planning brief will have some essence of this in it. In other words, provide for variability in the future, be efficient with what you build, try to use things like planning and organization to create other effects that are not necessarily architecture. Anyway, so this was that practice encapsulated. Cedric Price hired a scientist looking at systems, and he helped him first think about how to make an architecture which is not a building, but an architecture which is a system. An architecture which is, in effect, an ecology or a landscape. And they did a bunch of diagrams, and some of these look like the messy diagram I showed you. Looking at relationships, looking at how the building needs to evolve or perform when it's being used. So he's not looking at structure as a starting point, and they're not looking at form as a starting point. They're looking at how the building is essentially a framework, and how that framework can contain or allow or enable events to happen. And so one of the earlier diagrams to emerge from this was this kind of diagram. Just a simple representation of architecture as a truss, as a kind of volume, and then things plugging into that in different ways. And it almost doesn't matter what's plugging into it. What does matter is that you can plug anything into it, really. The eventual design, which was never built, or was built in a changed form in a different project, really emerged as just that concept, as a kind of open truss framework with various pieces plugged in. And everything in this building moved. Everything was flexible. Everything could be organized and planned to change scale, to change shape, to change in terms of its sort of technology, which would be available in any given room. And all of this was enabled by, and this is 1960s, by a kind of computer that they designed. And this is before computers could be put in a single building, really. Computers were not, artificial intelligence wasn't really a sort of thing back in the 60s, but the architects and the scientists thinking about systems proposed a computer which was in essence an artificial intelligence that would move the building. The building would learn from its users. So as more and more people wanted to come to this building and go to theater, the computer would decide to arrange some of the rooms more often into theater shapes. And so the building and the users have a kind of continuous feedback loop that actually constructed the form of the building over time, rather than a sort of fixed object. A view from a helicopter. And I argue that this is not a case study just for architects. This is actually a case study for landscape architects and planners as well, urban designers. One of Cedric Price's, not protege, but someone in that circle was Rem Koolhaas, who you probably all know about, right? OMA. Do they know about this? They know about this stuff, right? OMA is a very famous, big name architect nowadays. In the 80s, Rem Koolhaas was not a very famous, big architect or planner. But he did a competition entry for a park in Paris. And he had just written a book about towers in New York called Delirious New York. And he thought about the park as different from the kind of parks that were in Europe at the time, which were sort of scenic and you could stroll through them, and they had rolling landscapes or maybe some axial decorative gardens. He thought about his park as essentially a skyscraper on the ground, so tilted over. And so he created these strips. And in every strip, you could do something different. Just like kind of in a tall building, every floor can be something completely different. And so his proposal for this park didn't win. It came in second. But it proved to be really fertile ground for a lot of landscape architects and architects working in the 80s, 90s, and even today. So this becomes sort of very prominent starting point for thinking about the discipline of landscape architecture, about the discipline of urbanism today. Parc de la Villette, Rem Koolhaas, OMA entry. The stripy landscape, where you can do the landscape is sort of just a framework, just a holder for activity, and actually the design is informed by these different activities taking place next to each other. And one of the things that came out of this was the realization that in a park you don't have to plan every single thing. Not every space needs to have a name. That actually the most interesting things come out of the areas between things you program, where things overlap, where things hybridize. And so that kind of thinking, I think, is linked to, or you can actually prove that it's directly linked to a lot of Cedric Price's thinking about open-ended architecture and open-ended planning. So just a few images on the ground. The second point, the site. I want to argue that for you, site should not just be a boundary and an abstract idea of context. Maybe some history comes with the site. I want you to think about the site as being the material foundation of what you do. That the site is thick, that it has a lot of layers, and that you can mine those layers, literally and conceptually, to form the basis for your designs and your projects. There's a good quote from this that talks about the surface, about the site, by Stan Allen from about 15 years ago. And he's also an architect, but he used to work with James Corner, who's nowadays a very, very famous landscape architect. He's the one that did the High Line in New York City. Stan Allen says, increasingly landscape is emerging as a model for urbanism. Landscape has traditionally been defined as the art of organizing horizontal surfaces, so arranging gardens. By paying close attention to these surface conditions, not only configuration but also materiality and performance, designers can activate space and produce urban effects without building buildings, without traditional apparatus of traditional space building, which is towers and blocks. This gives landscape architects a lot of energy when they hear this. They're like, oh, we matter again. We can actually build cities. And it makes a lot of architects really interested in landscape as a practice, as a territory of thinking. So just some images about the ground and about how the ground can be conceptualized and can be thought of from the way in which civilizations have marked the ground, have changed the ground through drawing, essentially, on the ground in large scale, to architects like Raymond Abraham, who actually think of the ground as part of the space that we occupy. Have actually built not only on top, but actually carved out and started to create space in the ground itself as a physical material thickness. And then people like James Turrell actually working at the size of geology, at the size of asteroid impacts, for projects where he's taking, in the deserts in the United States, taking a crater and then recreating that crater as a place to observe the stars and the moons. to think about the ground, we need to be able to draw the ground. And this is something that is very difficult. How do we draw the ground? What techniques? Landscape architects? Maybe you know already. What are some types of drawings we do to show the ground? Section? What else? You have to speak up, I can't hear you. Contour lines, right. Contour lines, sections, these are ways we envision the ground, at least the continuous surface of the ground. But the ground has been visualized in different ways. The contour map shows only one way of thinking about the ground, and it's a very invented way of drawing. They didn't even draw contour maps 100 years ago. They drew maps of terrain differently. They shaded it so we could see how the sun would play across it. They weren't so concerned about documenting the topography. A lot of the way in which terrain was drawn 150 years ago was from the standpoint of military advantage. So the landscape, the terrain became a place where we could plan out military campaigns, and we could protect our cities, and we could sort of find areas of safety and areas of exposure in the landscape. So a lot of drawings like this came out to just look at high and low points, or places that were enclosed. We can also look at the ground, we can draw the ground in terms of its performance. And so this is something a topography map doesn't show. We can look at, for example, how water, so this architect looked at a terrain and mapped how water moves across the terrain. And looks at how water gathers and how water disperses. And mapped that completely across the landscape to understand how it could perform. And then that becomes, that map, not the topography map, but the map of water, then becomes, or it could be a map of wind, or it could be a map of how animals move across the surface. That became the map that he or she responded to when they were doing their designs. So when thinking about ground, you really have to think about performance issues, not just the aspect of it. And when you model the ground, when you create models that show your site, the way you model the site can be really important. As in this model that shows the site as a layered continuous surface, and then that actually is the same way that they built the building. So the building is thought of as a piece of ground raised up out of that surface, but also connected to that surface. Or Peter Eisenman thinking about the ground as a sort of tectonic, and then the building forms emerge from that same tectonic, the sort of truncated, octagonal, pentagonal shapes. So the third point is ecology. I go to different reviews around the school, different pinups, and I hear a lot of people talking about ecology, the ecology of the place. How do we need to think about ecology? Because in this room, we're not ecological scientists, we're not botanists, we're not naturalists, but we still need to work with ecologies. We need to work within ecologies, and we need to sort of appreciate them. So how do we think about that? How have other people thought about that? And I think successful ecological designs are very aware of ecological issues, but they also think of ecology very much in conceptual terms and can recreate those relationships at many levels. So I want to show you a few images about that. In Hong Kong, we live in the subtropical climate area, which is just above the tropical areas. This means very specific things about the ecological habitats that are native or that are possible within Hong Kong, If we go further south into real tropical areas, places like Singapore, a lot of Philippines, Manila, a lot of places that we think of as sort of jungly areas. That has very specific character issues for the way that we design spaces, and conceptual weight for the way we think about architectural space. So I like to show these two drawings when I talk about the tropical climates. This was a painting made by a Frenchman, Henri Rousseau, who had never been to the tropics, but he had seen the tropics pass through all different exhibitions in Europe around the beginning of the 20th century. So the empire was expanding its boundaries. A lot of places, including Hong Kong, were being incorporated into those boundaries. Plants and animals that people in Europe had never seen before were coming in, were entering the city through these exhibitions. And so in the empire, people developed this very robust, but at the same time shallow notion of the jungle of the tropics. But there becomes a rich tradition of thinking about design through these kind of paintings. And we can talk about racism as well as sort of ecology with this image, but I show it for ecological reasons. But when we look at places, and this is not Hong Kong, but it could be somewhere in the New Territories. This is in Yangon. We see similar types of spaces. And these are not design spaces. These are just, in a way, naturally emerging relationships between people and their natural environment. And I think these sort of things have much more in common with the Henri Rousseau painting of this sort of dense jungle of the shady spaces that are created under broad-leaved palm trees and plants, versus the kind of, this is in Hong Kong. This is what someone plans to do with some really amazing heritage area in Kuntong. They plan to do this. This is tropical design as currently represented by designers in Hong Kong. Tropicality, the ecologies that are potentially here in Hong Kong are really represented in shallow ways today. Very much about sort of some flowers on the edge, a few key trees, but then just, we like to call it greenwashing the rest of the project. You can see most of the green in this image comes from the floor, but obviously that would be like a stone floor, not a grassy floor. So just even in thinking about the quality of the environment is the first thing. When thinking about ecology, we need to think about actually just that habitat, that place that we live, that place where animals live, and try to represent that and build that in more deep ways, not in shallow ways like this. One of the, at least for landscape architects, you'll learn about this guy, Frederick Law Olmsted, who did a lot of work in the United States and a little bit in Europe, a long time ago, 100 years ago, or more. But he sort of led the way, even that long ago, in thinking about ecologies from the standpoint of a designer. The project I'll briefly go through, and how long do I have? Till 45 is in Boston. It's not a tropical climate in Boston, but just like any place, it has a sort of existing ecology, an emerging ecology, a changing ecology, even in the 1860s when this project was conceived. Boston was built in a floodplain in a marsh, much like many cities in Southeast Asia. It was built out of reclaimed land gradually, and the issues of reclaiming that land, such as watery soils, issues with drainage, stormwater management, were very much a problem in the 1860s. And the environment was very bad. It was mostly an industrial city, a lot of factories and things polluting the water systems. And so this once fertile, ecologically productive marshland became basically the sewer for the city. It became where everyone dumped all their crap. And it became a very big health issue. And so eventually it got so bad that the government had to do something about it, so they hired this up-and-coming landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, to give them some ideas for what to do. And this is kind of, the Fens becomes a city sewer. It became this, this really, really bad landscape. So he had to fix it. He had to really go in there and figure out how the water worked. And he had to figure out how the sewage systems in the area worked. He had to not just work within the boundary of his site, but he had to work a lot, very much further outside of that. He had to think about transportation. He had to think about how the government would pay for it. Because it wasn't a bounded project. It was a very, even though the term hadn't been coined, and it wouldn't be coined for another 100 years, this was a very messy problem he was asked to deal with. His solution was both scientific and metaphorically linked to the ecologies of the place. The first issue he had to deal with was solving the problem. So he brought tidal water back into the area to flush out a lot of the polluted water and soils. He created gates and weirs to sort of control the water at different times of the year. And he changed the transportation around this area so that it became a sort of enclosed urban park, but one in which water would move through on its way out to the bay. So this is at a time when there's a lot of landscapes that are being made in Europe that are very pastoral or very much sort of Beaux-Arts style, very decorative. He does something completely different. He has done pastoral landscapes in the past. Before he got this project, he had just finished Central Park in New York City, which many of you probably have heard of, which is a very sort of pastoral landscape that becomes a center in New York. For this project, he looked actually at the existing ecologies that were there, at the grasses, at the crabs that walked around, at the way in which the wind moved through the place, and he wanted to build a landscape and design a landscape that actually mimicked that kind of landscape, that mimicked the existing landscapes that were there before they were somewhat forgotten. And so, even though he's working in an area of Boston that in the future would become very rich and very affluent, his plan was to build a very much a working landscape and a landscape that echoed the ecologies of the past and looked nothing like what people were used to seeing in the gardens of the city at that time. It was a very, very much a functional landscape, an ecological landscape, a wild landscape, but one that was at the same time a public park. And we have to show pictures of it in the past because eventually, as the city grew around it, other designers came in and started to build beautiful little parks around their buildings, and so it doesn't really work like that. Today it looks like a beautiful pastoral park, but in the design of the architect, it was very much a functional, ecologically rich, yet also ecologically inspired environment. And then he made it link also to other parks. One part of his plan was to say, you shouldn't just think about this park, but there's a space for linking to another large park, and then there's this creek that we need to improve, and then over there's some backyards we can reclaim. And so we created this whole idea of a park system within an urban area, which is something that we can see as being very relevant in thinking today. Ian McHarg is probably, the architects won't hear about him again, but the landscape architects certainly will. Ian McHarg was an ecologist, a landscape architect, an urban planner in the United States, working in the 60s, 70s. He drew out some other issues about ecology that are still relevant within the profession today. He wrote a book, first of all, called Design with Nature, where he asked us to reconsider how we live as people of the world. He was a very open thinker in the landscapes around us. And he had a very simple technique for understanding his environments. He would draw them. And this was a time when they didn't have GIS, they didn't have computer mapping, they didn't have CAD drawing. So they would have to draw these maps by hand. They would look at aerial photographs, they would look at site surveys, and they would map different things. And his big revelation was that he would not map landscape types. Like, for example, this is a forest here, and then this is a meadow here. He would only look at their suitability for different things, depending on what the project was. This happens to be a project, the maps you see here were a project for, he was asked to locate a freeway going through an area of countryside. So he looked at that area of countryside only from the standpoint of building a freeway, because that's the problem in front of him. So he looked at the soils, and he mapped where soils were good for building foundations for highways and soils were bad. He looked at habitat and say, well, we don't want to build a highway in this really nice habitat, we want to build it over here. So he would make maps with shading from white to black, black being the least suitable, white being the most suitable for multiple factors. And then he would lay all these maps together on pieces of clear paper. And this became known as the overlay method. It's not something he invented, but it's something he made very popular. And all of those gray and white maps would lay on top of each other. He'd put them on the light table, and he'd trace a line in the areas that were left over in white, which again were the most suitable, and that would be where the highway goes. So it's a very scientific way of thinking about ecology. The process came out of a very informed way of thinking about ecology and living in the city. And it essentially evolved, that practice evolved into working with people in Penn, evolved into a computer system that would do the same thing. That computer system eventually evolved into GIS, which, at least for landscape architects, is a very big component of your education in Hong Kong. The thinking wasn't that piecemeal behind this practice. It was very much thinking about overall landscapes, about performance in landscapes, about habitat and ecology in very open ways. And he would look at not just single sites, but he would consider their functionality from the standpoint of the larger region that they sat in. So he was also careful not to just think about the site boundary, but to think outside of it. Cities, green cities. So you could spend many lectures thinking about landscapes in the city. I just want to give you two things to think about. In this region, we have to think about rapidly expanding informality, complex growth, directed growth. These are the urban conditions of Asia, Southeast Asia. This is a map showing Shenzhen over 20 years, showing the black areas are urban areas, showing how that city expanded rapidly over the course of a generation. Showing essentially the scale of that growth. That's a huge problem for any one of us as practitioners in the future to deal with. This is not even in Southeast Asia, this is in South America. Same issues though. Rapid development, low values for planning or landscape preservation. How do we reintegrate ecological value? How do we reintegrate public space? How do we reintegrate productivity into these landscapes? It's more than just making green lines. It's more than that. It's bringing in functional, deep working ecologies. In North America and in Europe, there's a different problem. in many cities, and that is that cities that were once very full and very much planned and built out are disintegrating, are losing population, buildings are being torn down, and so there's an opposite problem occurring, which is that the cities are vanishing, people are vanishing, and landscape is re-emerging from these places. And so the question there is, and this may happen in Chinese cities in 20 years, the question there is, how do we bring back that landscape in useful ways back into the city? And what are those, how can those not be really depressing types of scenarios, but actually really things that invigorate local economies and that are healthy and sustainable for people? There's a couple visual culture class, so I thought I would show also some key images you should know. You should know this diagram, which looks at it's basically an important diagram for thinking about green cities. I'm just blanking on the name of the guy that drew that. Cities of Tomorrow by Ebenezer Howard. This is one of the book that this guy wrote. He was not a planner, he was a financial guy, like a book guy. He was very smart, but he was more interested in numbers. But he wrote a treatise on city planning. Looked around him, this is in the early 1900s. He saw a lot of industrial waste, a lot of people living in unhealthy conditions, and he said he wanted to change it. And so he formed a coalition of people that were interested in building new types of cities. And he wrote a book called The Garden City, Cities of Tomorrow. And in that book, one of the central diagrams, one of the central creations, was this thinking about incorporating landscape into the city through green belts and through careful planning. He proposed this concept of a city called the town country, which was different from the town, different from the country, but was a merging of the two. And then he would propose master plans for cities to be built in those very functional, very rational ways. I've heard that the book that he wrote is one of the best-selling books ever in terms of books about architecture and planning in China, ever. It's been translated. And so many cities in the region are using these sort of concepts to plan their futures. And this sort of thinking permeates through the century and becomes relevant in different times, both from space planning of large cities, so thinking about not just planning new cities, but planning existing cities and planning green spaces around each neighborhood to a larger scale. This is Central Park. Thinking about how we integrate large-scale landscape systems into big cities. And so you probably all know this, but Central Park is not built, it's not carved out of the city. It's built first, and then the city grows around it. And it's really a manufactured landscape supported by lots of utilities and underground stuff. It's not a sort of natural remnant landscape, but it's a very produced landscape in the middle of the city. To thinking today about how we integrate landscape into cities, and now cities are really dense and full, and so we think less about big central parks, but we think more about landscape systems, about greenways and river corridors and armatures to hold the city in place around green functional landscapes. And so you'll see plans emerge like this that really deal with networks of ecology and not with just points of ecology. And so I'll end with just talking a little bit about some strategies as you go forward to use in your designs and to think about when you make proposals. And in some of the studios I teach, I try to get my students to think a lot about strategies, a lot about scenarios, and not at all about fixed plans or creating finished products. But that the work you do in the design studio is always about strategizing, and that the design works are always flexible and scenario driven. A good historical example that you probably don't know about and maybe not hear about again is also from Cedric Price, the guy who did the Fun Palace I showed in the beginning of the lecture. He was asked to rethink an area that he was very familiar with in an industrial part of the countryside in England. And it was an area of a lot of coal mines. It's very much a resource landscape. And weren't a lot of roads, but there were a lot of rail lines. There weren't a lot of population, but there was a lot of need for education, schools, these sort of things. So he did some mapping and found sort of 3 core areas that still had people left in them, and tried to map the different relationships between those people and their landscape. What he proposed was not a building, was not a town plan, but was a system for re-educating and reinvigorating the economies of this place. And he actually proposed a university, but a university that would be built on a railroad line, so a mobile university, that would be constantly in motion and moving back and forth between these 3 core towns. And he called it the Potteries Think Belt. Potteries area, the area was sort of famous for its pottery production, so this became the Think Belt in that area. And it was a center of education for people, and it was really modular, and it was really open-ended and totally flexible. And this was because he could not, as a designer, as a single designer, he couldn't know the future of this place. And he did recognize that his project would take 20 years to complete, and in 20 years there might be a totally different situation on the ground. So he would have to be really flexible in what he proposed. So he ended up with a very modular system that was actually organized along the transportation lines and constructed from things you could put on a railroad car. And so the university, the dorms, all of these things became this sort of modular institution that could shift and reemerge in different areas according to different population growth, according to different educational needs. So it's a very smart, simple way of thinking about planning for unknown scenarios. I at least like to look back a lot at Archigram, who you will hear about later in the future. They have a lot of work, some of it very meaningless, some of it very rich of ideas. One of my favorites is this idea of the instant city, and they proposed that in certain areas that were sort of in decline or where you needed to build events, these are not Olympics, but maybe smaller events, that they proposed a series of mobile infrastructures that could come in and drop useful functions and utility within a city and then leave. And that city could be reinvigorated sort of with the seed of infrastructure, with the seed of events. And when the blimp is what delivers all these things. When it leaves, you still have the remnants, you still have the pieces of this event-based architecture in place for new things to emerge in the future. So the project is marketed as this sort of instant city, but one of the outcomes is this sort of continuous rethinking of the city, of the armatures and the infrastructures of the city. A couple more projects I'll show, which are much more contemporary, which think about these open-ended ways of thinking about design projects and the kinds of drawings and the kinds of thinking that you would do as a student to convey these ideas. This is James Corner, Field Operations, working in a project in New York City on a landfill, a huge landfill. And the landfill was something that was still being created, trash was still going into it when he started the design. So the design couldn't propose some sort of instant plan. So the whole project became the strategy of building small pieces and building awareness of this landscape, adding functionality when different pieces were ready, but being very flexible about when those pieces could come into play. So the park emerges over a period of about 40 years, which is a real sort of urban time frame, urban growth time frame, in small pieces. But the master plan, the scenario plan, envisions a functioning structure, but actually works out how to create those relationships continuously over time. So you can see he makes a lot of these phasing maps, and creating a phasing plan is something that's very important when thinking about large-scale, long-term projects, urban-scale projects, landscape-scale projects. And in that phasing plan, he would deal with different types of things. So on one level, he'd be dealing with circulation. How do you create a landscape that's tied together always, even though different parts are being added at different times throughout the next 4 decades? And so we worked out how to create different circulation spines and how to create different types of circulation so that the place would be stitched together always. He looked at the ecologies. He looked at planting ecologies, not by planting a finished forest, but how to sort of plant one tree at a time, sort of to create a forest that would emerge after 2 generations, not instantly. So it was a way to save money too. And he looked at program, and he tried to map out all of the different things that people could do in this park as it emerged over time. That kind of thinking about staging, about not creating the finished thing, but about creating the seed that would lead to the finished thing in the future, was very smart thinking at that time in the United States. And I will argue that it's very smart thinking for this region today. And that is, it was very flexible and it's very economic. Designers weren't proposing that they would do all this stuff. They were proposing they would do very small things, and that those things would just grow on their own to full designs in the future. So it was a very strategic way of thinking about funding and about how you actually pay for these things. This park project, Downsview Park in Toronto, looked at these issues of staging and building up stuff over time in a couple different ways. One project by James Corner Field Operations looked at ecologies that build up over time through simple interventions on the ground. So his strategy was to just make little ditches in the ground, little canals, and that was it, earthwork. And then over time, that earthwork would carry water, hold water more than some areas. Over time, the area that held more water would grow different types of plants, according to the native ecologies. Over time, those different types of plants would lead to different kind of animals coming into the place. And so just by marking the ground, which was the proposal, he proposed that over 20 years, a rich, diverse forest would emerge from this place. And then Bernard Tschumi explored the sort of phenomenal effects of very similar thinking. So he made a lot of maps like this that looked at how plants grow together over time. And these became the armature around which he created the design. So he had different mixes of plants, different mixes of seeds that he proposed sort of planting in different areas. And different mixes of seeds would have different spatial effects over time. So it was a more architectural way of thinking, less ecological, but more environmental, thinking about the full physical environment, and about how that environment gets more wild, more dense, more provocative over time. And the project I want to end on, just very briefly, because I think it's a project done by architects, but it deals with all kinds of scales that we all work on, urban planning scales, ecological scales. etc., was a project done by a collective called Lateral Office. It's a sort of, they're very flexible even in how they organize their office, so I'm not sure which partners worked on this project. But it was a project to rethink in the high north, in a climate that we're not used to at all, a very cold climate, to rethink food in that area. So they looked at this Arctic zone, and they found a lot of inefficiencies. They found that the further you got north, the higher food cost, because all food was shipped in by plane or by a ship. So costs were really high. They looked at circulation here and found that there were a lot of circulation bottlenecks, so that food did not move very efficiently across the islands. And then they looked at what was actually there. They found that people were eating lettuce from California, and they were eating berries from Holland. And so they actually looked at what could grow in this environment and how maybe that could be the starting point for thinking about urban planning or urban design. And they found a lot of different proteins, a lot of different vegetables, a lot of different animals. And polar bear. I think they were mapping not just food, but also the food chains to understand what was there. I think you can eat seal. I think native people eat seal. I think the fat also is good fuel. And so their proposal was not a piece of architecture, it was not a park. Their proposal looked at these things. The devices people use to move across the landscape, and it looked at how the patterns that they move across the landscape, and it looked at creating essentially recipes of promoting different foods that people could eat and different ways that those foods could be delivered seasonally to the island. And so they made maps like this that looked at when things were available and created plans for how when those things became available, they could be exported within the island. So the whole territory became very much sustainable, very much based on what it could provide, and the cost to people was much lower, and the livelihood and health of people was as a result, much higher. Of course, in Hong Kong, we also live in an island which is very dependent on things being shipped in. We ship in designers, we ship in local experts, we ship in our food, we ship in our water. Everything is from outside. And so, for me, this project is an inspiration, not for the ecologies they're talking about. We don't live in the Arctic Circle, but we do live in a place where we could get much more out of where we are. And this involves all of us sitting down, all the different experts. It involves people not in the faculty of architecture, engineers, planners. But the hope is not to think in very disciplinary boxes. But if we think more like these designers think, we think much more to territorial scale, we think much more across disciplines, and we think much more richly about what's in the place and try to utilize that. So I hope you guys go forward and think more openly about your discipline. Thank you very much.